Hello, and welcome to an unusual chronicling of Warhammer 40k's grim history from the beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and today we have an interesting quirk from the grim universe. Now, through my chronicling of the Imperium of Man, I've found an interesting segment of history that is so strange, so idiotic, that it must be recorded. This would be the history of rogue trader Bartholomew Bilko in the late 36th millennium. A strange character who shows the peculiar side of humanity. Now, keep in mind, this man is not bound necessarily by the Imperium's edicts so much as the rogue trader's works, which gives him far more leeway than most. Most of the chronicling I have found is through the Commissar Licender Brine, whose works have been discredited by the administratum over the years as simple pulp writing at best, leaning more towards heresy. Yet through careful works of my own, I've discovered through other dictations that they seem to be more fact than fiction. So, without further ado, let us commence with the books of Bilko the Wily, written by Licender Brine. His first chapter is called Good Luck! Good luck, son! These words rang in the young man's head as he made his way towards the Nautilus, the ship he was to board and remain on for the foreseeable future. Licender pondered on what the old man could have meant by these words. The commissar that he was replacing had only said these 3 simple words, with an amused grin on his face. Was it a warning? Or perhaps just a friendly wish? Licender thought that perhaps it was the latter. Yet his musings disappeared as he stepped around the corner and took in the sight of the ship that would be his new home. It resembled a light cruiser, yet just barely. Surely had the usual bulk and intimidating presence of the standard Imperial cruiser, yet beyond that was the strangest craft the young man had ever seen. Painted black, other than its unusual bulbous bow that almost looked transparent, yet held a slight purple hue. Towards the front of the ship, on the underside, was a large gaping maw. Brine could only assume this was a dock for smaller vessels, such as fighters and transports to disgorge from. Towards the aft of the ship was a massive dorsal fin, so pointed and sharp it looked like a massive blade. And on the backside of the ship were 5 mighty engines, which lay just behind 4 wings that were crescent-shaped, the points of the crescent pointing towards the front of the ship. This was probably the most peculiar part of the ship to Licender. They reminded him of the wings of a Necron ship he had seen in pictorials at school, walking towards the docking port, which was quite large, exactly in the middle of the starboard side of the ship. He had to dodge and weave through the multitude of people who were bringing cargo to and from the ship. Making his way up the ramp, he noticed a man barking out orders and guiding the dock workers in their tasks. Hustling his way towards the man, he was about to ask him where to go when a forklift with a huge, grotesque head aboard its pallet rumbled past him. Brine's jaw dropped. It was the head of a Carnifex. The creature, long dead, still held a menacing snarl, its massive jaws lined with hundreds of razor-sharp teeth, the size of Brine's arm. So taken in the sight, he almost didn't hear the voice growl. "Can I help you, sir?" Shaking his head, Licender cleared his throat and said, "I'm supposed to report to Bartholomew Bilko. I'm the new Commissar Liaison." "Ah, ha, ha, the new guy," the man said with a smile. "Glad you could make it. We were going to be shoving off here in a couple of minutes. Nice to know the commissariat is as punctual as ever." The strangeness of the man's tone caught Licender a little off guard. Most people treated commissars with respect or fear. This man seemed almost friendly. A large fellow, he stood maybe a head taller than the young man, with dark blue-hued eyes, and black hair peppered with gray showing his age. Barrel-chested, he had obviously seen some combat, for his left arm and leg had been replaced by bionic counterparts. Shaking his head, Licender Brine didn't like this familiarity. He had been taught that familiarity leads to mistakes, which at the best meant he couldn't carry out his punitive duties. At the worst, The Commissar was killed by those he governed. With a glower he had practiced since his first days at school, Lucien said in a stern voice, "According to 2-37.5, Xeno's biological samples being traded or sold in the Imperium is cause for the harshest punishment, up to and including death." With a casual flip of his great coat, Brine touched the handle of his bolter pistol as he continued coldly. "Any who know of such things are also complicit in such vile traitorous deeds, and are subject to death themselves." The man's eyes flared with not fear, but anger for a second. He clicked his tongue against his teeth, and then a sly smile spread across his face, as he said darkly, "Well, you'll have to take that up with Inquisitor Mardax." "Pardon?" "Aye, Inquisitor Mardax personally requested this sample of Tyrannid to his ship. Since we are around the same segmentum, His Majesty and Lord Inquisitor asked us to drop it off here." Rummaging through his left pocket, the man pulled out a slip of paper and said dryly, "I believe this is all legal, according to the Imperial law." The opposite man was correct. It had the Imperial seal of the Ordo Xenos on it. "Now, speaking of paperwork, I believe you need to show some to me. After all, I am the cargo master on this ship, and while you look like a commissar, and you definitely sound like one, I would be remiss and fundamentally shot if I let you on board without proper authorization." With a haughty snarl, Licender responded, "You are a trooper?" The man's smile broadened, and he said with an obnoxiously familiar tone as he extended a hand, "Del, Cargo Master Del Flagrant. Pleasure to meet you, Commissar Licender Brine." "Well, pleasure to meet you, sir. But I will still have to see your paperwork before I let you on board." Licender pulled out his credentials and handed them to the man, rather than shaking his hand. "I believe that you will see that everything is in order?" Del glanced at the paperwork and then nodded. Pulling out a transmitter, he barked into it. "Hans! The Commissar is here!" Nodding to Licender, he gave a crisp salute and said, "Welcome aboard the Nautilus. Please wait here while your escort arrives. Should I be expecting an adjutant or bodyman for you, sir?" "Yes," Licender said stiffly. "My servant Ludd will be momentarily with my luggage. Please make sure that it reaches my quarters." "But of course, sir, provided he has the appropriate paperwork," Del said with a chuckle. Licender felt his face flush with anger. This man truly didn't understand his place in the universe. Before Brine could tell him where it was, Del's face dimmed and he got a sad yet distant look and said, "Sorry to hear about old Grimscar. He was a good un." "Who?" Licender asked, flabbergasted. Del shook his head as if to bring himself back to reality and said, "Sorry, the man you're replacing. We called him Grimskull." "You mean Commissar Namor Greyshore?" Del snapped the fingers of his robotic arm and said, "Oh yeah, I forgot that was his real name. Sorry, lad, but it's been so long since he started I had forgotten his original name." "Good luck!" These words echoed again in young Brine's head from the old commissar. Perhaps it wasn't a warning or some amusing joke. Perhaps he simply wanted Brine to look after the ship, like a shepherd looking after a flock. Brine smiled dimly as he said, "Yes, Commissar Namor Greyshore has gone on to greener pastures, and the commissariat has dictated that I continue to keep you in the Emperor's grace." "Right. Sure. Brine was shocked at the heretical response of this man, and he was about to reprimand him when Flargent glanced over and said, "Oh good, your escort is here. Hans, could you please take Commissar Licender Brine to his quarters?" The young man glanced over to who he was talking to and was shocked to see one of the Emperor's angels stomping down the ramp. 8.5 feet tall, the Astartes was in full armor, which was completely black. This was strange because he held no crest or insignia. Yet there was no mistaking an angel of death. Through the intercom of his helmet, the Astartes barked,
"He is requested at the commander's table. He can see to his quarters later."
"Well, lad, you heard Hans." Dell said with a slightly evil chuckle. And then he said something that almost stopped the young man in his tracks. "Ah, good luck!" Licender entered a large room that seemed out of place on the ship. If he hadn't walked into the room from the lower deck, he would have mistaken the place to be a log cabin. The walls were shingled with cedar wood by the smell, and a large oak table took up most of the room in the center of the strange quarters. On the opposite side of where he entered sat a man smoking a pipe, reading over a dossier. His head snapped up as he heard the door slide open and smiled at Licender. Standing, the man briskly walked over and extended a hand, saying,
"You must be the new Commissar Licender Brine. Ha ha! Pleasure to meet you. I am Bartholomew Bilko. Please, have a seat."
As Brine pumped the man's hand a couple of times, he gave Bilko the once-over. Standing about 6'3", he was slightly wiry, with a sly smile that seemed natural on his face. He wore black trousers and a simple white undershirt, under a great black duster. His blue eyes shimmered with an eagerness Licender had never seen before.
"I'm glad you're here, Brine. I was worried that you wouldn't make it. Shame about Grayshore, but it happens to the best of us."
As he took his seat, Licender said, a little perplexed, "What happened to him?"
"Getting old."
"Oh."
"Well, I suppose that'd be a good thing. Something I figured all of us in this line of work wish to happen."
Glancing down at the paperwork he had in front of him, Bilko continued.
I see you graduated with full honors from the Schola Prognosia, which, quite frankly, surprises me."
How so?"
"Well, I figured that someone with such high marks would be assigned to a colonel, or even a general. Why they would send you to me, I find intriguing."
Licender almost answered Bilko, yet he held his tongue. Bilko held the young man's stare for a moment, and then smiled and shook his head.
"Well, we'll get back to that. Tell me, Brine, what keeps the Imperium running?"
Without hesitation, Licender responded. "The Emperor's light guides humanity. He guides the men and women of humanity to purge the heretic, the alien, and the traitor in his divine light." Bilko smiled sadly and said,
"Very well rehearsed. But that is not what is keeping the Empire afloat. It's money."
Licender detected a glint in Bilko's eye as he said that last bit. Easing back in his chair slightly, Licender's hand itched towards the handle of his bolt pistol, as he said sternly, "That's heresy." Bilko's eyebrow raised slightly.
"Really? I think not. Relax, Brine. I'm not saying the Emperor protects. I'm sure he does. Yet what keeps the Empire together is not a dry husk of a man on a golden throne. It's commerce."
Licender's hand gripped the hilt of his pistol hearing this, but before he could even get a full grasp on it, he was staring down the barrel of Bilko's own bolt pistol. The young man knew he was fast, probably the quickest draw in his class. Bilko made him look clumsy, slow.
No need to pull leather. I'm not saying the Emperor isn't important. I'm saying that money is what keeps the Imperium going."
Not wanting to back down, yet seeing the very large pistol barrel stacked against him, Licender said harshly, "Explain." Bilko nodded, putting his gun down with a thump on the table. His hand remained close to the weapon, yet not on it.
Who pays you, Brine? Is it the Emperor?"
"I am paid by the Ordo Carinthia, like everyone in the Commissariat," the young man answered.
"I see. And if I recall right, the Astra Militarum is paid the same way. But where do they get their money? Surely it is not from the Emperor."
"Of course not. The money comes from the tithes from all planets under the Emperor's rule."
"Right you are. Of course, the tithes. Yet to continue on, we must garner more wealth, so we can pay more soldiers so the Empire can expand back to what it was before the Great Heresy. And how do you think that takes place? How do we get more money?"
Before Licender could answer, Bilko continued.
"More worlds, of course. Along with further avenues of income. That's where you come in. Our job is to discover new ways for the Imperium to increase the flow of gold, to the Golden Throne, all the way to the poor soldier on some misbegotten world. While we all do the Emperor's work, It is up to us, the strange vagabond rogue traders, who keep the lifeblood of the Imperium flowing.
Licender relaxed his hand on the hilt of his gun and said slowly, "That is a strange way of putting it, yet I see your point."
I'm glad to hear that, boy. Now, as opposed to some merchants, we sometimes have to rub shoulders and be diplomatic with the less than enjoyable crowd.
Meaning?
Those that most would deem enemies of the state. Pirates and Xenos mainly. Now, mind you, this is for the greater good of the Imperium, and never once have we dealt with the vile cultists of chaos, the true enemy of the Imperium. We must be amicable to those we see as enemies, for a number of reasons. Yet the most prudent would be so we don't get our heads shot off. But more importantly, we can garner the second most important thing for the Imperium.
Which is? Brine asked, confused.
Information. I can't count how many times I have been discussing things with an orc war boss, and he lets slip his next destination for a raid. Of course, we send that info straight away to the Navy, and the poor greenskin shows up to a planet confused as to why there are so many Imperial ships waiting for him.
Brine's jaw dropped. He couldn't help it. You have dealings with greenskins?
Of course. Not to mention just about every other Xenos out there. Other than the Drukhari. Personally, I can't stand them. They are far too arrogant and continuously talk about death and murder. And quite frankly, they are a bore. But what do you think about the Drukhari?
Brine shook his head in true surprise. He had thought this post to be a punishment of the boring variety, where he soaked his boots in the dull space exploration of the abyss for a few years before he was able to transfer out. This was not what he expected at all. I must apologize. I don't really know any Drukhari, was all he could get himself to say.
Well, be glad that you don't,
Bartholomew said. Standing to his feet, the strange rogue trader picked up his gun in one hand and walked around the table, extending his other.
I'm so glad we had this conversation. We will talk later, yet, unfortunately, I have more pressing matters at the moment, what with the ship getting ready to depart. But welcome to my ship, the Nautilus.
Brine stood and shook the man's hand. Yet after the second pump, the rogue trader's visage went from a warm smile to sternness in a second.
Now, I hate to do this, but I require your sidearm until we speak again after the launch.
It was then that Brine realized Bilko still held his pistol. It hung in a loose grip, but he was still armed. Why?
My crew's safety. We are more than a crew. We're family, and I'm hoping you join it. But until you meet them, I will require your sidearm so we don't have any misfires aboard my ship. Now, don't worry. I will return it once we are underway.
Bilko frowned at Licender's hesitation and said firmly,
I must insist, Commissar.
Something in the way the rogue trader said this left Brine with the understanding that his life depended on the answer. The young Commissar was at a loss. He really didn't know what to do. To give up his sidearm was a very punishable offense. Many a Commissar had been shot for such an action. Yet it was plain to see in Bilko's eyes that if he didn't, he wouldn't leave the room. I will be getting it back.
You have my word.
With his mind made up, the young Commissar unbuttoned his bolt pistol and held it handle first to the rogue trader. Letting go of Brine's hand, Bilko snatched it up and took a look at the weapon. Shaking his head, he said,
It's amazing to me what terrible weapons the Commissariat gives you guys. Perhaps after I give it back, you might want to visit Master Weaponsmith Korv, so he can get this hunk of junk to work better. Hans! We're done here.
The door slid open, and the massive black armored Astartes entered the room. With a nod to Bilko, he put his arm on the shoulder of the Commissar and said,
Perhaps you would like a tour of the ship?
Before he could answer, Hans ushered him out the door into the hall. Now, this is the first chapter of Licender Brine on his time aboard the Nautilus. And honestly, if he knew what he was about to see in the next hour, his meeting with the strange rogue trader would be the least peculiar thing he had seen all day. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this one. If you did, feel free to comment, follow, and subscribe. Join us next time when the young Commissar meets Bilko's crew. Have a great day, and as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.